Hello, welcome to the Roundtable. We'll provide you with profound and insightful analysis on key global affairs. Today, we are presenting a special edition on the 2024 NATO Summit held in Washington, D.C. last week. Here are today's guests. We are joined by Professor Kim-Hena. Welcome to the Roundtable.
Thanks for having me again.
We are also joined by Dr. Jo Bi-yeon. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO in short, celebrates 75th anniversary as the most representative collective security organization in the modern history. At the summit meeting in Washington, D.C. last week, the leaders of NATO member nations issued a joint statement. In that joint statement, they expressed great concern over deepening military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, and between Russia and China. So, Professor Kim, would you be kind to explain what NATO is to our viewers, and what is the main points of this year's summit meeting of the NATO?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded on April 4th, 1949. And it's essentially a multilateral alliance system of countries that are committed to protecting each other and defending each other when there is a third-party attack. And originally, there were around 12 founding members, but right now, there are around 32 members.
32 now.
Yes.
Right.
And so this recent summit, which took place in Washington, it was considered the 33rd summit, and it actually marked the 75th anniversary of NATO. And in this summit, they went over several important key issues, one of which you mentioned already. They reaffirmed that they will continue to support Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky actually participated in the summit because of this. There was also an emphasis on deterrence and defense, and the members decided to renew commitment to implement the Defense Investment Pledge, which they agreed on last year, which would modernize NATO. And the third is to deepen global partnerships with non-NATO members who are close allies and also liberal democracies who will work together to defend the liberal international order.
I see. South Korea is not an official NATO member country, but President Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea attended the NATO summit meeting for 3 consecutive years. Bloomberg said that South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol is one of the most influential leaders attending the NATO summit, despite the fact that South Korea is not a member. Professor Jo, it's a very interesting phenomenon, right?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I think for NATO's position, South Korea now weighs in 4 very important areas. Number one is, as we all know, NATO's recent threat focus has been primarily Russia.
Right.
And since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's have been really focusing on how to respond to this new threat environment. But recently, as we saw, North Korea and Russia, they came down to what we could call a mutual defense treaty, the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. And the NATO countries, they did reflect on North Korea threats before in their strategic documents, but they were not really tangible so far. But with this treaty, and also with the estimation that North Korea has been supporting about 10,000 munitions to Ukraine war, North Korea suddenly became a real tangible and direct threat to NATO countries. So for them, South Korea has a very important role in many areas, especially, for instance, information sharing. And I think that's the reason why President Yoon, during this NATO visit, they agreed to share North Korea weapons information between the two countries. And second of all, South Korea, although it is indirect, has been supporting US's initiative of this Ukraine war. So for NATO, South Korea is an important value sharing country.
Right.
And thirdly, NATO has been emphasizing their modernization efforts, but the thing is their defense industry is not as so proactive as the countries like South Korea. So defense industry is another key sector that they are really interested in. And last but not least, I think we have to mention the Trump factor. I think assassination attempt of the Trump, many experts now say that Trump's return is almost guaranteed.
Right.
And the member countries of NATO has been concerned about if Trump comes back, he will begin this kind of NATO bashing to increase their defense budget to share more defense costs. So in that regard, NATO also sees South Korea and also Japan and Australia, other countries, as a key partner in hedging this kind of uncertainties.
I see. At the summit, the biggest issue was NATO allies' assistance to Ukraine, as Dr. Jo mentioned. More exactly, the focal point was how much they should increase their assistance to Kyiv. In the context, it was also discussed what types of assistance, including supply of weapons, South Korea might agree to provide Ukraine. What was actually reached as their conclusion and consensus?
Yeah, so as Dr. Jo mentioned, because of this revitalized North Korea-Russia relationship, there is a lot of emphasis on what South Korea is going to be doing, what kind of assistance South Korea is going to be providing. And during the summit, President Yoon announced he pledged 24 million US dollars to NATO's assistance package for Ukraine. So he said specifically that South Korea will provide security support, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction assistance to Ukraine. So last year, South Korea provided 12 million US dollars to NATO's Ukraine Trust Fund. And so this year, he is promising to double that.
I see. Dr. Jo, let's get more details about some of the points you addressed. South Korea's role. You said that South Korea has not changed its long-standing policy, which is that South Korea will not trade or provide weapons of mass destruction, right, to countries involved in military conflict.
Yes.
But South Korea has provided significant amount of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, right? And at the same time, South Korea agreed to loan, artillery shells to the United States. So United States can provide more ammunition to Ukraine, right? Will there be any change with regard to this long-standing policy of South Korea toward Ukraine?
I think we could not say no. As we saw with the North Korea and Russia coming down to this mutual defense treaty, South Korea, many of the experts posited that this direct assistance could be an option. The reason why we have not really got there yet is that South Korean government is being very cautious and doing a kind of a strategic assessment of the treaty. If we read the treaty, of course, many things are very worrisome. The Article 4 revive Russia's immediate support in case of war. It says
even military intervention.
Intervention, yes, using all means of military and other assistance means. And also Article 3 was about how they will build a consultative mechanism during peacetime as well, kind of reflecting what South Korea and US has been doing through the Nuclear Consultative Group. And also there was a clause on increasing their interoperability of their weapon system, which underlie supply of military technologies, which is very worrisome. But I think the reason why we have not chosen direct assistance yet is that we are trying to leave the room for persuasion and management rather than a kind of a full-fledged interpretation of the treaty. Because we, all other kind of allies and treaties, we do have our commitments, but that's in a sense a declaratory act. And there is a room for implementation, and we do not know how deeply or how succinctly as written will be implemented. So in that sense, I think South Korea is laying out more cards, more step-by-step cards that they could use depending on how the situation changes.
So making no official announcement about change policy of South Korea toward Ukraine, that does not necessarily mean that South Korea does not have any effective and strong leverage upon Russia and North Korea, right?
Right.
Okay. On the sidelines of the NATO summit, President Yoon held a series of bilateral summit meetings, including the meetings with US President Joe Biden and with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Professor Kim, it's very interesting that these Asian leaders, so to speak, have separate meetings in the sidelines of the NATO summit meeting. And it's very impressive that trilateral security cooperation forged among three countries, US, South Korea, Japan, continues, right? What can we make out of all this?
as Dr. Jo mentioned, North Korea and Russia signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty in June. And this stipulated mutual assistance in the event of a war. And so in this sense, even after signing this treaty, there was a joint press conference and Putin did not exclude military assistance to North Korea, which means that North Korea may be likely to acquire mature technology to develop weapons of mass destruction. So this really shows the urgency of these leaders in liberal democracies having to meet. And so President Biden, President Yoon, and Prime Minister Kishida met on the sidelines of the NATO summit to discuss these recent developments in the Indo-Pacific, and they affirmed their commitment to closely coordinate their policies. And these were essentially follow-up conversations of previous meetings that they had in Seoul and Tokyo.
Dr. Jo, let's stay more with the Trump factor in the future of the NATO. Assistance to the war in Ukraine. The Republican Party candidate, presumptive candidate Donald Trump, just dodged a bullet in the assassination attempt during his rally in Pennsylvania. So the speculation in Washington, D.C. is that his candidacy looks brighter than ever.
Yes.
What do we see for the future of the NATO if Donald Trump is coming back to the White House for another 4 years?
This is my personal interpretation, but from what I've been hearing from the NATO countries, one of the things that they mention in informal gatherings, they say they are glad that there would not be another second term. So they know that the 4 years would be the end of the Trump administration. What that means is that it's important for them to struggle through, muddle through the 4 years. And I think for Trump factor only, it's hard to change what has been developing in NATO, in my opinion. US has decided to reposition the tactical nukes on UK, and NATO countries have now Sweden and Finland newly joined the group. So there is the impetus, the stimulus there. I think it's hard to be curbed by Trump factor.
I see. You must have watched President Joe Biden using that media conference at the end of NATO summit meeting as an opportunity to gain back his traction in the campaign after a disastrous performance in the first presidential debate that we covered last time.
Yeah, so as Dr. Jo mentioned, there is a lot of concern among NATO members if Trump does come back, especially because Trump has stated many times that he doesn't want to work with NATO countries, and so in that sense, from NATO's perspective, it's to their advantage that President Biden has a second term. But there were also a lot of concerns related to President Biden as well. He did misspeak on several occasions. He did make several mistakes, but in general, it seemed as though most leaders of these NATO member countries were still in favor of Biden. They were still supporting him. So for example, French President Macron, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and Finnish President Stubb, they all complimented Biden and they rallied around him. President Macron actually stated that Biden is still in charge and that he knows the issues well and that he himself makes mistakes quite a lot. And so they were showing that they were fully supporting him. And even though President Biden did misspeak, he was able to address many of the questions, especially related to foreign policy questions.
Right. Let's talk about another issue. South Korea is not the only country that was invited to the NATO summit for 3 straight years. The so-called Indo-Pacific Four, or the IP4, has recently received a lot of attention. Let's take a look at the video.
Cooperation between the NATO and IP4. The first document jointly signed by the NATO and IP4. The IP4 security linchpin. What is the IP4 then? The IP4 or Indo-Pacific Four refers to the NATO's partnership in the Indo-Pacific region and is a 4-member consultative body among South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. The grouping, which used to be dubbed the AP4, has been renamed the IP4. Launched at the NATO Summit held in Washington in September 2019, it has been working as a consultative body tasked with strengthening security and economic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. The partnership seeks to jointly counter security threats and create a stable security environment through sharing information, holding joint military exercises, and ensuring maritime security. The regional cooperation has become more necessary in the face of a rising China, which is significantly expanding power and influence. China is increasing its military presence in the Indo-Pacific region by pursuing maritime expansion and enhancing maritime operation capabilities, which include plans to deploy 6 aircraft carriers by 2035. This move is raising military tensions with neighboring countries and fueling security concerns in the region. These changes in the security environment were the key reason for the creation of the IP4. In response to China's military expansion, the group is contributing to maintaining a strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific region.
So this is an opportunity for the IP4 countries to demonstrate what they can tangibly offer NATO and European security. So we're expecting to see 4 big announcements on Ukraine, but also countering disinformation, artificial intelligence, as well as cybersecurity. We're also going to see a lot of work happening on coordinating defense industrial resilience, how both regions can work together in terms of arming each other up. So South Korea in particular has a lot to offer, as we've seen, for instance, in providing munitions to support European partners who are supporting Ukraine.
It also aims to achieve sustainable growth through economic cooperation. By working together to keep supply chains stable and develop core technologies while jointly addressing climate change. The IP4 is not an official organization yet, but it is expected to play a greater role as a key consultative body in the region.
During this year's NATO Summit, the role of the IP4, which refers to NATO's Indo-Pacific partnership, was emphasized more than ever. Dr. Cho, what was the agenda of the summit among these IP4 members, and how are they expected to make important contributions to international peace and stability?
Well, first of all, I think this IP4 is the 3rd time in series. But this IP4 format actually originated from 2016. The 4 leaders' global appearance began in 2022 in Madrid Summit, but the discussions have been started in 2016.
It has a long history.
Yes, and from then on, they have been focusing on North Korea issues. But as this year's NATO Summit began in the backdrop of Russia and North Korea coming down to the Mutual Defense Treaty, the IP4 countries, they really focused on this implication of the treaty and how North Korea's involvement in the war affects the Russia's ongoing war with Ukraine. So that was the main big pillar of the IP4 discussion. And on the side, they also discussed about how they will continue their flagship projects, which include about 4 areas. One is contributing to the support of the Ukraine. Second area is the cyber defense. The third is on the disinformation arena. And then number 4 is on the artificial intelligence. So by contributing in the Russia-North Korea issue and also this new sectors of security issues, the IPP4 countries are in line with the NATO countries to contribute.
Professor Kim, it seems like we cannot think of the maturation of IP4 as a partnership without considering the escalating military threats posed by North Korea. Now, North Korea-Russia partnership has been enhanced as well.
Yeah. So as Dr. Joe mentioned, the IP4 has participated in the NATO summits for the past 3 years, which indicates that the relationship between the IP4 and NATO are getting closer. And this is becoming more necessary because of this driving force or this emergence of strong authoritarian regimes, including Russia, including China, North Korea. And so right now, the international community has to work towards a collective effort to safeguard the liberal international order. So as a result of that, the IP4 member countries, which includes South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are working closely and cooperating with NATO countries, despite the fact that NATO originally focused on, the North Atlantic, like the Western world, right? But now it's becoming much more of an international issue.
I see. Dr. Jo, the joint statement does not only pinpoint the military threat of North Korea and North Korea-Russia partnership, but also China, right? But it is very interesting that the way that China is criticizing the joint statement of IP4 is similar to, but at the same time different from how China was criticized the Washington Declaration.
Yes, I think first of all, I think we have to see that the IP4 statement and the NATO statement have different character and scope and purposes. The NATO's, as we saw, it's very comprehensive and long, and it lays out the NATO member countries' key threats and how they will respond to. So it's a very comprehensive joint statement. On the other hand, the IP4 statement it's more of it's a short symbolical statement. I think we have to see that IP4 is not yet institutionalized organization, and for that matter, coming down to shared threat perception and writing down itself is the accomplishment. So it's less comprehensive than the NATO statement. So I think we should see it more as a distinctive format of the two documents.
표석님, if I were China, I wouldn't have felt so positively about China being mentioned in a critical manners in joint statement of the NATO summit meeting. How did China react to the outcomes of the NATO summit meeting in IP4?
So as you mentioned, China was not very happy. China's kind of been stuck between a rock and a hard place where they're trying to juggle and manage the situation by working with Russia economically, but also trying to limit its cooperation. But this is also the first time that NATO has directly criticized China for being a decisive enabler of Russia's invasion to Ukraine. So in that sense, from China's perspective, China stated that the statement that NATO made is biased, and that China will never accept unfounded accusations made at this NATO summit. And so they are saying that they have different political systems and values, but China did say at the end that it's still willing to maintain contact with NATO and conduct exchanges on the basis of mutual respect. So I think that was where the emphasis lies.
Despite China's strong opposition, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell said he supports the idea of formalizing and institutionalizing the IP4. In Section 30, the Washington Summit Declaration endorses stronger cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific partners. Dr. Jo, how is it likely for the IP4 to be actually institutionalized as conceived by Mr. Kurt Campbell?
In my personal view, it's quite likely because, as we discussed earlier on, IP4 format has originated from 2016, so we have a quite history. And also, way before in 2000 and 2010s, NATO has been reaching out to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and these IP4 countries to set their bilateral relations, and building upon that, they have created this IP4 format. So the institutionalization background is, I think, in my view, already there. But what's left is how to regularize and how to, whether they will continue to focus on North Korea issue or they could expand upon. That's something we could work on.
Come to think, it is an amazing story that NATO just celebrates the 75th anniversary, right? Because at the end of the Cold War, in the absence of the military threat from Soviet Union, NATO's days were numbered. This is what was speculated by many experts, but NATO is still alive and kicking, to say the least. Charles Darwin asserts that everything evolves. It appears that the NATO is no exception to the wisdom of Charles Darwin. This is all for our special program on the 2024 NATO Summit. We'll be back next week with more up-to-date news. Dr. Jo and Professor Kim, thank you so much for sharing your insights and excellent analysis.
Thank you.
To all our viewers in the world, thanks for watching and goodbye.